Coppice forestry is actually one of the oldest human forms of agriculture, and I think we learned it from the beavers, really.
Hey, I'm Michael Yadrick, the host of Tree Hugger Podcast, and I am broadcasting from the land of the Puyallup people, otherwise known as Grit City, Tacoma, Washington. This is the show where we discuss the role moditional, that is, modern plus traditional, methods play in ecological restoration. The methods we talk about on this episode are known as live staking, coppicing, and pollarding. When the bark is removed, branches pruned, roots harvested, or leaves picked, beloved plants can regenerate their body parts, often very quickly. My guest on this episode is Alex Slakie, who is a restoration ecologist, botanist, and herbalist. He currently resides on the shared lands of the Cascades, Clackamas, Wasco, Multnomah, and Chinook peoples in Corbett, Oregon. Alex is the head of Flora Northwest LLC, a business that supplies willow live stakes and seeds for salmon habitat projects, sustainably harvested wild medicinal plants for herbal companies, and interesting nursery plants for home gardeners. He grows and wild tends willow coppices and stands of medicinal plants in the western Columbia River Gorge. On a book recommendation from Alex, I picked up William Bryant Logan's Sproutlands, Tending the Endless Gift of Trees. Logan explains it by saying, from 10 millennia to about 200 years ago, every person in every forested part of the world would have known exactly what we mean by coppice and pollard. The idea is simple. When you break, burn, or cut low the trunks of almost any leafy tree or shrub, it will sprout again. New branches will emerge from behind the bases, either from buds that were dormant, waiting for their cue to grow, or from twigs newly formed by the cambium. Logan goes on to explain the etymology of the words for trees in some cultures was synonymous with cutting, specifically chopping with the revolutionary Neolithic axe. Then the term pollard means dehorned animal, or refers to something that has been pulled, cut, or sheared. Instead of cutting low, pollards are cut high to avoid the browse of animals. So the next time you walk through your local forest, look with a keen eye if the trees surrounding you arose from seed or are memory from resprouting. Putting forest trees into a couple different buckets, trees may reproduce 1 by seed, 2 resprouting from dormant buds below or above ground, or 3 a combination of the two. They may do this in the best of times or in response to damage or senescence. Many tall forests of the world are dominated by single-stemmed reseeding species and go together with seedlings in their understories. The resprouting species may be subdominant in these forests in absence of some naturalish disturbance or maintenance by humans. Sometimes resprouters are branded as producing fewer viable seeds. However, we know they can provide economical and scrumptious fruits to accompany those seeds. These tall trees who are dedicated to growing vertical can be at risk of disturbance such as fire driven by climate disruption, and their limited route to regrowth is through dispersal of voluminous tiny seeds back into the fire footprint via wind, birds, or people. If seeding or replanting is hampered or delayed for some reason, forests might switch into a woodland architecture of multi-stemmed resprouters that can handle the frequent disturbance. Resprouting from dormant buds is an important mechanism for persistence. Some resprouters may be able to resprout continuously for literally thousands of years. Many favorite species around my home have the ability to regenerate from the meristematic tissues such as Saskatoon, salmonberry, huckleberry, and soapberry. More ubiquitous species like poplar and oaks also have that capacity. In the conversation you are about to hear, Alex and I talk at length about willows. Restorationists working in riparian areas around here are most versed in installing the product of a willow coppice. The stems or stakes cut from a willow stay alive for weeks to be bundled and transported from coppice land to a spot where we want willows to grow. That is generally a site that's moist, perhaps a creek or a stream that we want to shade for salmon to thrive. If we don't put that live stake directly in the ground, we might put it in a pot filled with soil to grow roots that in turn will be sold or outplanted the following season. We segued into this topic a few Tree Hugger episodes back. Chelsea Armstrong articulated how people prune hazelnut in orchard gardens to cultivate abundance of edible nuts, as much as for strong, flexible wood for cordage and building shelter. At the top of a youngish tree, people have also been cutting Pacific crabapple for thousands of years, causing them to partially fall over and then regrow closer to the ground for easier access to the fruit. There are contemporary applications for coppice and pollard we have barely imagined yet. Alex is currently working on setting up systems for fire mitigation in forests using coppicing and biochar production. Alex shares the sentiment, I think, with many of you listening that the conservation and ecological restoration fields are at a critical moment in time and are being asked to examine and change their roles in colonization through combining restoration with social justice work. Every day, more and more, I'm convinced blending the modern plus traditional methods of ecological practices has the potential to sustain healthy and diverse everyday ecology in reciprocity with the cultures we take care of at the same time. I'm glad to bring Alex to the show. He is passionate about connecting people to the land through ecological restoration and plant medicine. It starts right here. Enjoy this conversation with Alex Slakie from Flora Northwest.
My name is Alex Slakie. I live currently in Corbett, Oregon. This is on the lands where the Wasco, Cascades, Chinook, Clackamas, and the Multnomah peoples all historically lived. I live at the headwaters of Big Creek, which flows down into the Sandy River, which then flows down into the Columbia. And I am a ecological restoration practitioner focusing on coppice forestry and live stakes production for salmon habitat projects in this bioregion. I also am a collector of native plant seeds for the industry and grow a small nursery of native plants and medicinal plants as well.
Boom. That's great.
Cool.
You're like all I thought and more. You're like a multifaceted individual. I had no idea of all these skills and hobbies and things you had. That's cool. Would you be willing to talk about the origin story of your enterprise? I know there's some
Sure.
changes going on right now.
Yeah. So I went to the Evergreen State College in like 2004 to 2007, and while I was there, did a work study program at Sound Native Plants, and that's a nursery in Olympia that supplies a lot of plant material for different restoration projects in the Northwest. And through that, started working with the crew that was doing live stakes and just really got interested in that and went with it and worked as an independent contractor for some years, and then helped to start a business called Salix Solutions, which is still going, and it's business that basically works up in the Chehalis and Puget Sound watersheds. And now I am embarking on a new venture called Flora Northwest, and that's basically doing the same thing with coppice forestry and live stakes production in the Columbia River watershed and the Willamette Valley.
Nice. And can you, for people who are not really savvy about what you just said, like what you do specifically,
Yeah.
can you describe like the purpose of the work and the origins of the tradition of coppicing?
Sure. Well, so my understanding is that coppice forestry is actually one of the oldest human forms of agriculture, and I think we learned it from the beavers, really, because all over the northern hemisphere, beavers, willows, and salmon historically have existed together, and in North America versus Asia versus Europe, there's been different ways that coppice forestry has been something that has been done. And it is basically when you cut down a hardwood tree or shrub and then it sprouts back. Conifers, for example, are some trees that don't coppice well. You cut them down and then the roots die back and you have to start over. But with not all hardwoods, but many hardwoods, you can chop them down and they sprout back from the same living root system. And in Turtle Island, North America, fire coppice was like a huge practice. And, we talk about like the fire management plans of the oak savanna, but this was also extended well into the other parts of the forest, and it was a form of coppicing. And then there's European traditions that go deep into coppice forestry, and including another technique called pollarding, which is where you're basically doing the same thing, cutting the tree down, but instead of doing it at the ground level, you're doing it higher up, and that like creates this whole section of the ecosystems where larger animals can move around. And it was oftentimes done in pastoral systems, and the trees that were being coppiced were used as animal fodder, as well as building materials and basketry materials and firewood and et cetera, pretty much like everything that human civilization historically has done, has had something to do with plants that were chopped back and then sprouted forth again.
Right. We have a hedge maple in the yard out here, Acer campestre. It is entirely hollow on the inside and just like keeps trucking. So from what I understand too, it's one of those species in the fence rows, like you can chop it down and basically, and it will resprout on you and just kind of creates this really dense hedgerow. But then these other species I think you probably work with, which are like black cottonwood,
Yeah.
salmonberry. They have that superpower just to keep living,
Yeah.
I guess, forever.
There's like a botanical term called a lignotuber. It's like cells that maintain viable dormant buds at the base of a tree, and it's basically like a reset button on the life of the tree. And as soon as it's cut down, these lignotubers come into action and sprout more sprouts out, and they basically are like a baby tree that's starting over and doing the exact same thing that it had done before.
Wow.
So yeah, the
So
immortality question is really interesting, because sometimes I wonder when I'm coppicing old willows like out in certain swampy areas, and you get down and you can see that they've fallen over with storms, or beavers have cut them down, or they just get old. Another symbiont in the with the willows, I think, is the fungi, because so often like the willows are just completely colonized with all these what are considered pathogenic fungi, but they rot the tree to the point where the top falls and breaks off, and the top is still alive. And so when it hits the ground, boom, the roots start, the whole process starts again. And so you actually can see in wetlands where certain patches might be all these individuals, but they're the same genetic like
clone or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right term. I don't know if there's a discriminatory term for them, but I think that might be right. I don't know. Yeah. So, man, I'm so pumped you're talking about lignotubers, because my favorite tree, the Pacific madrone, definitely has lignotuber, and that's one of those fire adapted species, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see with all these fires that we get. It's all up and down the madrone range, and it'll be interesting to see how they resprout from that lignotuber. From what I understand, there's all these dormant buds, which are kind of like stem cells, and all these carbohydrates and power that are stored in this structure there right at the base of the ground. And they can just resprout. You see like things are damaged or bitten or eaten, and things can resprout. It's amazing. So one question I ask everyone is what their favorite tree is. So I don't know, it might be hard for you to tell me which one, but also I did have this question about which species you work with, which you've already started to talk about. So I am curious what your favorite trees are to work with and why.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm so into trees, and there's so many I love. My two favorite trees are actually the grand fir. I don't know why. I just love that tree. And I also love the Gary oak, which is just an amazing keystone species in the oak savanna. And oaks are a coppiceable tree. And also with
Good to know.
Yeah. A lot of times you'll see oaks with multiple stems, and they'll be like, is that one tree, or is it a bunch that just grew right next to each other? And I think oftentimes it really is just one tree that you would either cut down or burned in a fire or something happened to and sprouted back. Of course, they don't all always sprout back, but they can. As far as the willows go, there's a lot of different kinds. There's two main groups of willows. There's the sandbar willows and then the shrubby slash tree sized willows. The sandbar willows, they actually will sprout from underground roots. So they'll send a runner out and then shoot up a new stem. You'll see cottonwoods actually will do that sometimes. For the most part, the main willow species used in restoration are not that type. They're Sitka willow, Pacific willow, Hooker's willow, which most often on the inland is called Piper's willow. Schooler's willow is the other big one there.
I'm a big Schoolers fan. So with all the willows, how does someone identify species to be confident you're harvesting the correct plant? So like you might have been alluding to, some of these species have different conditions where they desire or they grow best in, right? So like a Pacific willow would grow in a maybe similar, maybe overlapping set of conditions or environments that they grow in, but Schoolers willow has perhaps like a greater tolerance for drier soils too?
Well, willow identification is definitely complex, and so I use basically a variety of characteristics in combination, which would be like the flower, the form, the bark, the leaf, and particularly in our field of coppicing for live stakes, the buds, because we're working in the season, but also the way that it chops underneath the loppers and the pruners gives you a lot of information. Like Schoolers is a very hard willow. It grows more upland, some oftentimes, but it also will hang out just at the edge of the swamp with the black cottonwoods, and there is like a very much like overlapping range that all these different species have. And it's really just one of these things where over time you start to understand, and then you start to see, oh, well, it's not just like willow that's different than one species being different from another, but there's like within the species there's all these different forms, and they're dioecious, so the males and the females will actually have slightly different forms from one another, which makes you think, oh, it's a different species. But as far as the restoration practical aspects of it go, it's more like matching where the willow where you're getting it from to where the project is taking place, that it's going. That's the most important thing, just that it's a similar situation. Like you wouldn't want to take a Schoolers willow that you're harvesting on a mountaintop and put it in your coastal estuary project or whatever. I wouldn't doubt it if the Schooler willow would just say this is fine and grow anyway. Like it is a very versatile and adaptable species, but it doesn't grow quite as fast if, say, you're really looking for your shade coverage on a water to bring the temperature down or something. If you compare Schoolers to the Pipers or Sitka or Pacific willows, those three will they'll get a little taller faster.
Good to know. And you mentioned something too, I don't want to pass this by. You talked about the different feelings or the way they respond to you, right? With your tools.
Yeah.
Is that what I heard you say? Which tools do you use? So maybe you're using pruners, you're using chainsaws.
Yep.
They feel differently under the tension that you're putting on them. I don't know too, do they feel different or they smell different, or walking through them? Is it harder to walk through some thickets than others?
Well,
it's a lot of questions.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yes to all those. We use chainsaws, arborist saws, basically, to where you can really get in and maneuver around. A lot of times, where I cut willows, I've already gone through and cut them before. So in those circumstances, using loppers oftentimes works just as well as using the chainsaw. So a lot of the coppices The wild tended coppices that I work in are on farmland and places where I'll get like an agricultural lease or something like that to work the riparian edge. And oftentimes it's places where the beavers have been eradicated. It's still this huge ongoing thing in agricultural spaces that beavers are seen as a nuisance, which is unfortunate. And so the willows, they've been in relationship with the beavers for millions of years, a really long time. And oftentimes it is the beavers that are keeping the stands of willows actually cut, which then keeps them going. Oftentimes we'll see willows that haven't been coppiced growing to the point where then they actually just die. And so a lot of times, like, I'll go in and what I call set coppice, where we'll find the old willows, chop them down, and oftentimes I make pollards to where there's a whole understory that deer and people or, whoever can get around in. And then it's kind of this novel ecosystem technique because you have a bird nesting habitat that's in less than a year coming out of these pollards. And you'll oftentimes have, depending on the height of the pollard and the year, either the first year of growth or the second year of growth, at different heights, different bird species come in and nest. And when you have a lot of stems right next to each other, there's more connecting points for the nests to go on.
I love it. And because we're on radio, so I think I've seen examples of pollards. Probably if you just type it in your favorite internet search tool, you'll see some
Yeah.
examples of it. I think maybe I've seen poor examples of it. What does it feel and look like for people who are unfamiliar with that term or what it looks like?
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you talk to people in Europe about their perception of pollarding, it's much different than if you talk to Americans. And Americans generally see it as this like hideous, you've just taken this, you've chopped it completely down, but it's 6 feet high, and it's just this ugly stump. And that's maybe true for the first 9 months of its existence. But shortly after, it just, it grows, especially when we're talking about willows, quickly it will grow this whole new crown of vegetation. And I think that there's a perception that pollarding is more detrimental than it actually is. And I would just encourage people to look into the history of that and learn. There's actually this great book that I just read. It's called Sproutlands: Tending the Endless Gift of Trees by William Bryant Logan. Just came out like last year or something. But pollard and coppice they're both nouns and verbs, because you go to the coppice, which is a place where it's being done, and then the act of coppicing is when you're chopping them down. So it's this old thing that's coming back, and as we start to look at it, yeah, there's all these like yet to be utilized practices that can be integrated into environmental restoration projects.
So for the new folk, people that are new to it, what's your advice to anyone doing this technique for the first time? Should non-professionals try it? Are there any big no-nos in doing this so people don't go doing something dumb or harmful?
I would say that the main no-no with coppicing is don't do it in the active season when the leaves are out in the spring and the summer. It's something to do in the dormant season. And then you're just going to have way better success as far as that tree having the energy and vitality that it needs to sprout back up.
So last summer, for the first time, we did some staking in the summertime. So there was a landslide, and so to stabilize it, we had access to some plants. It was like late summer, kind of early fall perhaps. And I was like, well, what are we gonna do? Because like once the soil decants, I guess, or dries out, it just gets hard as a rock.
Yeah.
And some of this clay layer has been brought up to the surface. So I was like, well, let's give it a shot. So we had a stand of willow like up the hill, and I had the crew go cut it. And so we're just kind of rolling the dice. I was like, what's going to happen? Like, I had no experience with it. I'd never done it, but I kind of expect like mediocre results.
It's definitely possible to do it in the summertime, and the trees that are coppiced can and do recover, and the cuttings can grow, but just the overall success rate of to the cuttings and their viability, as well as the ability for the tree that was coppiced and cut back to regenerate, is much lower in the summer. And also there's just like there's a lot going on out there in the summer. There's birds that are nesting, and all the bugs, and the whole ecology is utilizing those places during the growing season. And so it's a lot. It just seems like a better time to do it when everybody's asleep in the rainy season.
That's a good segue, because I did have a question for you about guidelines for ethical and effective harvesting. What is your thought process when you are entering a place that has been coppiced before, or maybe a new spot?
Well, I think one of the main things is to make sure you have permission. And for some people, that's just like a permission from the landowner. But it's also, for myself, I think just asking permission of the place is important. It's not so much a thing that is emphasized in scientific communities, but I do think it's important, especially because a lot of times with willows, they very well might have been, somebody else might have, that might be their stand, or it might have been some people's stand that like maybe was doing that there a long time ago, and I haven't done it in a while, but you never know. So I just think getting permission is a good ethical thing to do. Also, if you're only seeing one type of willow, just being careful that you don't cut the one, if there's only one individual of one kind and there's all these others around it, that you don't cut that one down that might get shaded out by the regrowth of the others or something like that. So it does make sense to be educated about what the species are, or at least like a general idea. There's not very many willows that are endangered, but there are, like Salix prolixa on the west side is one it's around here and there, but a lot of times you'll just see, one, and like one prolixa and 56, or something like that, and they don't look that different. So Mackenzie's willow is the common name. Yeah, and it's mostly on the east side, but they're up around Puget Sound and the Willamette Valley as well.
That's cool. Okay. So besides cutting stakes to recreate a new plant, is there any other use that you're familiar with for willows or some of these other species? Is there any traditional ecological knowledge that you incorporate into your practice and work? And I guess what other uses can we imagine for these species?
Yeah, coppicing is pretty much a traditional ecological knowledge or technique, because traditionally, at least in this area, the willows were used for temporary structures and basketry and all sorts of things that are woven together, as well as pretty much everywhere where willows are found. And I mean, in England today, there's kind of this resurgence of woven fences and people who are doing these amazing coppice forestry and then using the willows to weave fences and make art and wicker furniture. And a lot of the uses like are extinct, and I would say that there's a huge potential for the uses of willow to come back into play if we start thinking outside the 2x4 Douglas fir paradigm in building. So yeah, I would just say that willows have a lot of uses.
So you talked about your customers, I guess, or the people you provide this material to and matching it to the right conditions. You also talked about how it could be used for building. So I guess what's the market for it? Why are people interested in purchasing it from you?
So right now we're pretty much just fully marketing willow as live stakes because
Mm-hmm.
we're making trees, and the customers are for the most part government agencies, but there are also like a lot of contractors that are doing stabilization of slides or working for the DOT or projects with stream bank stabilization. But most of the customers are government agencies that are working through the federal Salmon Endangered Species Act money. So one of the things that Flora Northwest is hoping to be leaning into more with it is actually the coppice forestry as a product for fire mitigation and carbon sequestration. So one of the things about a coppice forest is that if you just let a tree grow, like a willow tree grow, it's growing and getting to a certain size and sequestering carbon through photosynthesis. But if you cut it back and then wait a couple years and then cut it back again and then wait a couple, and they're doing that in perpetuity, I think there's different life cycles depending on how often you chop them back. But the biomass that's created that way and the amount of leaf and photosynthesis that's happening is way more than what the non-cut tree would just do in its lifetime. And then say you were to take all the material from that you had just cut down and make live stakes out of a portion of it, and then the top gets turned into charcoal or made into biochar. Not only is that tree sequestering carbon as new trees into future sequestration, but then the biochar, if you just put that back into the landscape, that's carbon that's sequestered right there, and then your tree is sprouting back with even more vigor than if it was never cut before to sequester even more carbon. And then, yeah, like with the hazelnut example, if we were to do the same thing, not just for live stakes, but like to go through the understory of our conifer forests and cut and make biochar, is a mitigation for fire because there's not the ladder fuel to get up and do the
Mm,
major like intense burns that we're seeing. If that's all been already turned into charcoal underneath, and there's
right.
a much more open understory, which of course like indigenous people have known forever.
Right. And probably that's something that's been lacking in the ecosystem for decades at this point in time, that kind of ongoing management of the willows or whatever, the mid story of the forest. So, yeah, it's cool. I mean, what you're explaining is really this regenerative process, right? It can be this kind of self sustaining prophecy,
Yeah,
right?
totally. I mean, I wanted to also just say in regards to like people experimenting with coppice is that it is something I would actually encourage, because it's one of these ways where like us going in with our blundering human ways of being and just chopping down trees is actually like it's like a building block in a relationship with the land that is something that's drastically missing in our ecosystems, being that humans are this huge keystone species and we have this whole ability to positively affect the ecosystems that we live in and around. And the trees, they're just like, where you guys go? Where'd the beavers go? Like
To the
come.
cities. That's a great point. That's lovely. Like you said, the forest is like, where did you go? So do you think there's any cultural significance in Cascadia for this sort of work, or our relationship with these plants that you're working with?
I would say that if you talk to anybody indigenous to this area, that the willows are of great cultural significance, but this settler colonial society that we live in, as for myself at least as a white person, like being able to look into my ancestry in Europe and seeing these same willow, salmon, beaver, human interactive environments, where there wasn't like one species being like more important than any of the others. It just feels like learning about how to to interact with salmon and willows can be such a process of reconnection that can be healing as well. And I think that that's very important. It's one of like the kind of missing pieces in our whole restoration field, is we're very much running around using this great tool of science, but like it's pretty easy to be like, oh, like I'm going to come up with this hypothesis and then follow that and then prove my hypothesis pretty much right or not or whatever. But then, somebody could take the same plant or whatever you're talking about and make a completely different hypothesis and then, also see results there. I think that's, especially in the invasive species realm, that's a huge issue, because we're basically like looking at the negative effects of these plants that we're also calling bad and evil and all these other and through our scientific method we're able to show that our labeling of them as bad or whatever, as invasive, is a real thing. But also, like if you were to say take a blackberry or whatever and then like make a hypothesis about like the invertebrates that are utilizing this that wouldn't have this space, because I know I look out in my crazy blackberry project that I've been working on and see like, oh, the Apodontia are down in there and there's like every kind of pollinator and bird imaginable.
I think when they're not dominating the space, they can definitely add some value for sure. I mean, demonizing species like English ivy, or I'll just call it ivy. I've seen whole blog posts just ranting and raving how it's just rat habitat, and of course we've demonized rats,
Yeah.
so no one wants that. And then blackberry is sort of portrayed as this sort of depauperate ecosystem too, where just like a few other non-native birds use it.
With restoration, it just feels like if there was a way, and I know that it's a big economic question, but to have more people working on less land, instead of like the way it kind of works now is like how many people can, or how few people can we get to cover the greatest amount of land to save the most money or whatever. But like really that mentality just doesn't seem like it's getting us anywhere. I mean, there's like little examples where you can say, oh yeah, this like has improved or whatever, but I just really think it all comes back to like how do we build more relationships with the land and get more people building those relationships.
So that's a great segue in thinking about growing the community. Do you have any advice for entrepreneurs out there wanting to start their own business? I don't want to create more like competition out there. I don't know if
Yeah.
I don't know if it's like you're throwing elbows. There's so many people wanting to get in the live stake game, but I think it is interesting to show people like the opportunities that are there. And obviously, I think you've illustrated how cool it is, and so I feel like people after listening to this, they're just going to want to go out and start doing it.
Yeah, well, I really realize that there is only a certain amount of funding for this work that's happening, but I also realize that in order to like effectively make change, we need to like make that funding exponentially greater. And when we talk about the salmon and bringing them back from extinction, we need to be talking about major dam removal projects, which would open up a lot of potential. But as far as for people going into the restoration field, I would just really encourage them to think outside of this invasive species paradigm and think outside of this chemical approach to eradication, and how can we like do things that are simultaneously creating that resilient diversity of natural ecosystems and bringing the people and the human into those systems as active participants.
Nice. It's a great soliloquy. That's cool. Well, I'm glad this conversation worked out. It's a few months in the making.
Totally, yeah.
I'd really love to get on the ground with you at some point in time. I know it didn't work out back in February.
Yeah, no, it's great to talk about it. I'm passionate about it, and I feel like there's a lot of there's a lot of potential. I really feel like with the carbon sequestration and fire mitigation, those are two huge issues in the Northwest that we have this potential with coppice forestry to really do some great things.
I think too, it's nice that you can come in and fill that little niche.
I do a lot of other stuff too, and we didn't even get into the whole
Yeah, we might.
medicinal.
Yes, which I'd love to talk about at some point in time. Maybe I'll have you back on in the future. Yeah, talk about medicinals and seeds. I'm always trying to learn more and spread the word too. So.
Yeah, spread the word, spread the seeds. All right, cool. Thanks,
Yeah,
Michael.
I love it. Thanks for being on.
Thanks for finding Tree Hugger Podcast again and tuning into this discussion with the Willow Whisperer, Alex Slakie. You can now donate to the show. At the Tree Hugger website, there's a PayPal link. If you are in the position to donate some funds, it would help offset some of the show's costs. Thanks for considering. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for information about Alex Slakie, or you can find out more about him online at treehuggerpod.com. We are on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show. The music from the show was from DJ Freedom. One can find a link to them in the show description. Thanks for hanging out.